Welcome to Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I am your host. It's great to be with you here today. I am so excited to have Os Guinness on the show. We will be bringing him on here in a couple of minutes. Just before we get on the air, we've got the Patreon link in the show notes. Sign up there, support the show, get some free content there where it's exclusive for Patreon members. So you're going to want to sign up. I've got some new episodes dropping that will only be for patrons. Before we bring on Os Guinness, I wanted to read the excerpt from his new book, 0 Hour America. We're going to be talking about America, its history, freedom, all these kind of things. And Os is a legend in apologetics. And his excerpt from 0 Hour America says this: America has lost its way, and America will fall, unless revolution, oligarchy, or homecoming. Americans are approaching a 0 hour for the Republic and its distinctive view of ordered freedom. America is caught between two revolutions and alternatively suppresses and squanders freedom with a prodigal carelessness, with little understanding of the responsibilities that freedom requires. Os Guinness warns that if America abandons its distinctive ideals and ideas, we will have carved into the chronicles of history yet another example of the failure of a free society. Like other crucial times in world history, the present crisis is a civilizational moment and also a pivot point that could lead to a national renewal. Outlining 7 key foundation stones of freedom, Guinness lays out a pathway for defining and ordering freedom, righting national wrongs, and passing freedom's baton from generation to generation. Human freedom is precious and rare, and citizens who prize it must do what it takes to renew and sustain societies that are free for all of their members. America's window of opportunity is brief, and the alternative to renewal is bleak. The present moment must not be missed. Welcome to Foolproof Theology. It is great to be with you, and I'm so delighted to have my guest today, Os Guinness, who is a legend in Christian apologetics. Os Guinness has written so many books on engaging culture. Specifically, I've read books on American renewal and cultural engagement and those kind of things. Os, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me, Chase. It's a privilege.
I wanted to get into a bit of your story right off the top because, from what I understand, were your parents missionaries in China? Is that correct?
Yes, they were medical missionaries. I was born there during World War II, so my first 10 years were surrounded with war and death and violence and revolution and all sorts of nasty things.
Wow, that's incredible. And did you move back to England after those 10 years, or what happened then?
I went to school and university in England. I spent some time with Francis Schaeffer at L'Abri.
Okay.
And then came over here with my wife, and I came over here in 1984.
That's great. When you think about living in China during the season you lived there, I mean, obviously you were under 10, and I think about my kids. I have a 7 and 9 year old. And so, you know, those years are formative and you experience a lot, but you're also still a child, so you can't really process what's going on. Were those years marked by the Cultural Revolution in China when you were there, or was it predominantly the strife of World War II when your family was over there?
Well, not the Cultural Revolution, but the Chinese Revolution. The Cultural Revolution came later. But I was there in the Chinese Revolution. I tell the story in another book, January 1949, when my dad said to me, "Son, we're in trouble. Chiang Kai-shek has abandoned the city and we're at the mercy of the Red Army." And in they came. So I remember I was 9 when I was able to leave. So I was 2 years under the Chinese Revolution. My dad was tried, false trumped-up charges which fell apart, but many of his friends, well, thousands were imprisoned and some executed. It was a terrible time. And later when I was at Oxford, I was at All Souls College one night with my tutor, and one of his friends was Isaiah Berlin, the great Jewish philosopher. And as we talked, it turned out he'd been a 7-year-old in the Russian Revolution. And I'd been a 7-year-old in the Chinese Revolution, the two great Marxist revolutions of the 20th century. And for both of us, it marked us for life.
Yeah, that is not surprising. I think the reason I'm curious, knowing that part of your story, I've been talking with my wife and some friends, some pastors, about the last 2 specifically years in the United States, but even the last decade, you see pictures and you see videos and of statues being toppled and all these things happening culturally. And part of me wonders, as someone who's experienced that kind of thing, who's been marked by that real experience, how do you make sense of the last few years? Is it fair to refer to it as some kind of cultural revolution, this kind of cultural Marxism? How would you help me kind of make sense of what's going on?
Well, I think what we're seeing, I always start with America's present division, the great polarization. America's as deeply divided as at any time since just before the Civil War. Why? Is it the social media? Is it the coastals against the heartlanders? Is it the populists, the deplorables over against the globalists? And all of those have some part to play. But I think the deepest division is between those who understand America and freedom from the perspective of the American Revolution, which was, of course, decisively biblical through the Reformation, and those who understand America and freedom from the perspective of ideas coming down from the French Revolution. Because if you look at postmodernism and identity politics and the sexual revolution, going down the line, right down to cancel culture, you're dealing with ideas that come from 1789, not 1776. So it's not communism. I mean, I saw the second of the great communist revolutions. That's classical Marxism. What we're facing, as you know, is what's called cultural or neo-Marxism, which has slightly different roots. Karl Marx, yes, but via Gramsci and people like Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School and so on.
And so do you see a lot of these kind of like flashes of conflict, and whether it's riots or statues or, I was even reflecting when I was at Oxford this summer and they had rainbow flags hanging above all the colleges, and my friends who were with me, we were reflecting. It's like, why would you raise a flag? Well, it's to signify that you've conquered something. And it feels like there's this kind of impulse with the kind of cultural neo-Marxism that it is revolutionary. So do you think it's a fair thing to categorize it as a revolutionary kind of movement that's kind of reached a tipping point? Or is that too dramatic of an interpretation?
No, not dramatic enough. But the question is, whose revolution? If you go back to, say, Yorktown and the climax of the American Revolution, when the British and the Hessian troops were defeated, they were ordered to march out and surrender to General Washington and to play the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." Now that tune, "The World Turned Upside Down," came from the 17th century English Revolution, and its roots were biblical. In other words, you had the idea, and you can see it in Scripture, take, say, the people who charge Paul for turning the world upside down. In other words, the biblical idea is God creates order, creation. Humans create disorder. So to turn the world the right way up, the Lord turns it upside down in terms of its present status quo. Now, that is the biblical understanding, and the English and the American revolutions were built on that. Now, the French, the Russian, and Chinese are quite different. They're secular, anti-biblical, anti-religious, anti-Christian. So they use the word revolution, but it's entirely different.
I see. Okay, that's really helpful. Thanks for answering that. One of the questions that kind of comes up with that, with the kind of secular squashing out anti-religion, would you say that we even live in a post-truth world? That is there even a coherent system of morality that's opposing Christianity? Because to me, it's so ever-changing and ever-evolving. It's hard to even nail down an ethical system to evaluate or a worldview to really confront. And so it feels like you're constantly, at least as a minister, I'm constantly having different conversations around different topics. But would you say it's fair to say that we live in a post-truth culture?
Oh, absolutely. Now that went back to the Economist cover in 2016, I think it was. But of course, the ideas go back to Friedrich Nietzsche in the 1880s, and his idea, if God is dead, truth is dead, and you're left with what he called Perspectivism. And at the end of the day, as he put it, you have many different eyes, that's a form of relativism, but you only have power. And that's the real danger, the deadly danger of our post-truth world. So everything is now undecidable. There's no certainties, no moral knowledge. Now that comes down to all sorts of things. So in America, you take George Orwell's idea that a war is peace and slavery is freedom, a kind of upside-down subversion of words. You have in America one worse, what Freud called projection. People accusing other people of the very thing they're doing themselves. So you can actually see the one-party politics, authoritarianism, growing, and illiberalism on the Democratic side. But they're the ones who are accusing their opponents of being extremists, semi-fascists, and so on. So you're in a topsy-turvy world, and often you have no idea which is up, which is down, what's right, what's false, and so on. It's a very dangerous world because all that's left is power and coercion and manipulation.
It's extremely dangerous. How do you help people when you're thinking as an apologist, when you're thinking as a Christian, and you want to help people that are kind of caught up in the narratives that, you know, they believe the projections that are being put out there regarding the very people that are the most illiberal are accusing other people of being illiberal. What's a way that you can help them kind of either snap out of it or maybe explore a different narrative so that they're not so trapped? Because that's how it feels, is they're like almost held hostage by this kind of ideology.
Well, I think one of the simplest steps in apologetics is to love people, listen to them, discover where they are. Where is their heart? And at the end of the day, you want to know, are they open to the Lord or are they closed? Most people are closed, and you've described people very perversely resistant. Now, with people like that who are not open, not interested, not needy at all, opposed, then the first simple step is to push people out to be true to what they say they believe, which we know is wrong, until they hit their heads against the wall. And that's exactly what, say, judgment often is. It's not God zapping people arbitrarily. It's God leaving people or driving people to the consequences of their settled choices. But a good example of that apologetically is Elijah on Mount Carmel. Here he is, one prophet against 850 false prophets and the royal establishment and the people sitting on the fence. So he's very much a minority. He doesn't say, come back to the Lord or Israel will fall apart. No, he says, if Baal is God, follow Baal. In other words, Baal was not God, and the best way for them to see that was for them to try and do what the Lord alone could do. And when they hit their head against the wall, Baal didn't answer, and he mocked them. Then they could turn around, and the fire fell. You know the story. But he pushes them out to be true to their belief in Baal as the best way of bringing them back. And we've got to do that today. In other words, a lot of crazy ideas. People think, abandon truth, you're more free, do what you like. No. You're lost, and you're open to manipulation because all that's left is power. Very dangerous. So
given these circumstances we all find ourselves living through and in, how can we find hope as Christians? What does it look like to remain hopeful and steadfast, almost like Elijah, like we just talked about? What does it look like to be somebody who's remains we don't want to be optimistic for the sake of being optimistic, but trusting in the Lord and moving forward with a hopeful optimism about what God can do? What does that look like? Because I'm tempted, if I'm honest, to just throw my hands up in the air and just go, what's the point? You know, there's these powerful people that I can't change. Don't seem to have any effect over. I live in a very blue county in a very purple state. And it's probably the bluest county it's Boulder, Colorado. And so, you know, what can we even do here? And it seems futile at times. So what kind of hope can we find given these circumstances?
Well, you live in the infamous People's Republic of. Now, which
right.
Berkeley used to be, and Madison, Wisconsin often is too. But I think we don't believe the crazy things that people are resorting to these days. In other words, it's not a cliche to say that the gospel is good news, the best news ever. But we've got to so explore that. So take the political things we're talking about. The highest view of human dignity and worth is the notion that people are made in the image and likeness of God. The highest view of truth to counter sheer power. The highest view of words, the power and preciousness of words, in order to counter the craziness of it just being words, words, words today. Go on down the line. The biblical view of freedom, magnificent, compared to the crisis around us. Or justice. You know, too many pastors have drunk the Kool-Aid, and they got far too close to the Black Lives Matter views of justice, which are entirely different from the prophet's view of justice and the biblical view of justice as a whole. So we are the heirs, the champions, grateful servants of the greatest news ever. So hopeless? No. And it's not just we believe we're right, and it's a matter of sort of self-vindication. Sure. We believe this is the best way forward for humanity in the larger sense, as well as our neighbors in our communities and our colleagues at work and so on. This truly is the best news ever. But we've got to get from pastors down a renewed confidence in the glories of Scripture and the glories of the gospel.
Amen. That's been one of the biggest things that's helped me over the last 2 years is having that confidence. It's not some kind of unholy swagger, but it's a confidence in the Lord that, hey, we have confidence in what he said, and he will do what he said, and he will come again. And we believe that he offers the best way for people to be reborn and also restored to right relationship and renewed into who they were made to be. And so carrying that kind of confidence, honestly, it's not new in the sense of like, I never knew that before, but I think in a lot of, we planted a church. And so when we planted, we kind of had this, not subservient, but a less confident apologetic approach where it was more, we were trying to just learn a lot and listen a lot, which is part of it. But I think I failed at times to really show up with the full confidence of what we've been given. And that's a real disservice to our churches. If we're constantly trying to contextualize or whatever it is we're saying, where we're not really showing up to the most pressing matters of the day, the hottest battles of the day, with the full counsel of God, and doing so in a way that's loving, but very truthful, then our churches are not going to experience the renewal that God really wants us to experience.
I couldn't agree with you more. You can put it that a huge part of the restoration of America will be the reformation of the pulpit. And a part of that will be a revival of the biblical notion of words. America, with the social media and the tweets of the former president and so on, has cheapened words and hollowed them out and weaponized them. Whereas if you look at the biblical view of words, they are powerful and they're very precious, and you have to treat them with great respect. So evil speech in the Hebrew Scriptures is tantamount to murder. If I'd known the former president personally, I would have said, Mr. President, talk to your daughter and son-in-law as Orthodox Jews and ask them what the view is in the Hebrew Scriptures of words, because the way you tweet, and many others tweet, are absolutely vile, and we've got to stand against it. I like a lot of your policies, but not the way you insult people, and so on. So you pastors have a great privilege and an immense responsibility.
When we think about cultural renewal, I think this is where we kind of get into your book, Zera, Our America, which is coming out. By the time this episode airs, it will be out. So we'll have a link to it in the show notes. Was a lot of this book inspired by this kind of desire to see cultural renewal, or how would you describe your sense when you're like, I'm going to write this particular book? What inspired you to go, this is the time that this needs to be said?
Well, actually, I had a previous book that's longer and richer, basically on the Hebrew roots of the American experiment. And some people took it seriously and some didn't. So I was really frustrated. I'm living here in Washington, D.C., and there's no national leadership on the level of a Lincoln. And many Americans are fighting this, that, or the other in what I call trench warfare. There's no generalship. And so I confess that Zera Our America was an attempt to write a shorter book, an impassioned book, that first set out the choices that are now urgent and cannot be delayed. The choice between the revolutions we've been talking about, and so on. And at the same time, trying to put in the middle sections, what I call the 7 foundation stones of freedom. Everyone talks about freedom, highly controversial. We got to say what we mean, and a Christian view of freedom is decisively different at many, many, many points from the views around us. And we've got to defend what is right. A lot of Christians have given it up altogether. And you go to the New Testament, Paul's letters, for freedom Christ has set us free. What does he mean? You know, you have a pastor famously saying you've got to unhitch the Old Testament from the New. Whereas the greatest view of freedom politically, socially, is Exodus. And Exodus had a tremendous impact through the Reformation on the English and, more importantly, the American Revolution. We've got to understand it, because those things will be the salvation points politically for the American crisis today. So this shorter book is much more impassioned.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, we preached Exodus this past year, and I remember talking with some of our members, and they were like, because I was trying to implore our church to see that, yes, for freedom Christ has set us free, but that freedom is for right worship and right obedience. It's not to live this kind of libertarian ethic of live and let live, which is what our governor here in Colorado is a big proponent of. And so they were perplexed on this matter, because for a lot of evangelical Christians in America, the idea is that for freedom, Christ has set us free. And so, you know, it's all about freedom. And it's like, yes, but what kind of freedom? What are the characteristics of that freedom?
At the same time, though, Chase, I hope your people at the end of it realize the roots of American freedom in Exodus. For example, Constitution came from covenant. The consent of the governed is in Exodus. Separation of powers is in the Old Testament. Go on down the line. We're defending something that's profoundly biblical. And this is incredibly important, not just because it's biblical, but it's the highest, richest, deepest view of freedom the world's ever seen. And it's so important, back to your question of hope. We want to be the people that point humanity forward. So here we are. We've got a crisis in the West, the looming authoritarianism of countries like China, and you can see singularity and all the high-tech AI stuff coming down the line. We've got to be, as followers of Jesus, those with hope, because we can show humanity a way forward with these great biblical truths. And you pastors, you're the ones who break it down to us Sunday by Sunday.
Well, I guess on that topic, one of the things I wanted to explore was, you know, you've got this great call to go back and explore the biblical roots, particularly focusing on the American Revolution, going through some core freedoms. A lot of people have today in their mind a kind of boogeyman of a word that they're using, a phrase called Christian nationalism, where when you start speaking this way, their concern is that you're trying to either impose your religion on people or you're trying to make America into some kind of Christian nation. I'm assuming, as someone who's written extensively on this topic and has thought deeply on it as well, do you have any thoughts or reflections on the current conversation on that particular matter?
A lot. I've been accused of being an American Christian nationalist when I'm not even American. Anyway, but take the idea. In the old days, the tension was between the local, say a town hall in Massachusetts, and the national, the governmental, the Congress, and so on. We're in the global era, where the tension today is between the global and the national and the local. So national has a bad name for the globalists. We as Christians, let me be clear on a whole number of things. First,
Sure.
globalism, globalization. Globalization is a process by which the world is becoming more and more interconnected. Globalization is at the heart of the scriptures. In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. The Great Commission. We have global interests at our DNA as followers of Jesus. We're not afraid of globalization. Globalism is not a process, it's a philosophy. Okay. Those who believe in the global at the expense of the local and the national. George Soros, The Borderless World. Klaus Schwab, Global Reset. H.G. Wells, Global Republic. One World Government, and so on. So we understand globalization, but we do not agree with globalism. Now, globalism is what pronounces all nationalism as dangerous. Okay. But in fact, nations are still the way that most people understand their broadest identity. Now, let's make a second distinction. George Orwell distinguished patriotism from nationalism.
Okay.
Patriotism, a sense of belonging in your community and so on. Nationalism, right or wrong, an idolatry. Now, Christians should warm to that. Whenever a nation is made an idol, right or wrong, it's very dangerous. Only the Lord is God. Our nations are not God. We can be patriots, but not nationalists. Now, this term, Christian nationalism, has been picked up by many of our smart aleck college professors who haven't understood the whole impact of globalism. So they're picking up the globalists' attack on nationhood and just using it to describe any Christian who's a patriot. So I personally, I'm not American. I defend the American way. We've got to critique it. Take, say, the notion of slavery, which was accepted at the beginning in the Constitution. Vile, hypocritical, inconsistent, sinful. But I still would defend the American experiment at its best because it is the deepest, richest way of ordered freedom the world's ever seen. But I'm not for a minute a nationalist. I'm actually British. I was mourning our own wonderful Queen yesterday. I'm British, not American. But you can defend your nation as a patriot without being an idolater and a nationalist.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think I did an episode recently with one of these fellows, who's my friend, and so we were talking about Christian nationalism, and we're a lot of it comes down to semantics and linguistics and etymology of words in terms of what we're able to redeem, what we're able to put to use, what's in bounds, what's out of bounds. The irony to me is that a lot of Christians are happy to try to repackage the phrase social justice. And of course, as Christians, we're about justice, but they're trying to redeem that phrase to be, take it from the world and put it in the pulpit or, put it in the Bible, which to me seems unwise. And I'm afraid, some of the stuff on nationalism also comes down in a similar kind of discussion. It can be useful because it is the thing that the New York Times and Washington Post are accusing us of. And so, one of the tactics to try to defend yourself or try to fight back is just go, fine, yes, that's what I am. And that's a great temptation for people my age today. So how would you respond to that temptation?
Well, I answered that really by showing what we're in favor of, patriotism,
right,
but what we're against, an idolatrous nationalism. But let me broaden it in another way. I meet people all around the country who say, well, I'm like the early church. I want to be faithful. I just keep my head down. It's all beyond me. And that's a bad parallel. The early church were faithful, incredibly courageous, under an imperial dictatorship. They had no room to move politically. They were not in a democracy like Athens or whatever. It was an imperial dictatorship. We are not in America. America comes from the Hebrew Republic. One of the features of the Hebrew Republic, if you read the Torah, every Jew responsible for every Jew. You love your neighbor as yourself. in other words, there's a collective responsibility. There's a solidarity of collective responsibility. So every American citizen is responsible for American Republic. So for Christians to fail to do that today, it is a failure of discipleship, of calling, but a failure of citizenship. Now, tragically, you've got leaders like Biden who have no interest in citizenship. Allow a couple of new people, 1 million people, in the southern border. Well, they're here. They're not even, no attempt to make them citizens. Or you take civic education. It's collapsed in the public school. And in came Howard Zinn and then the 1619 Project. So citizenship is dying in America. So as one scholar said, it's relatively easy still to become an American, get your naturalization papers. But it's increasingly impossible to know what it is to be American. In other words, citizenship. And that's absolutely suicidal for the Republic. And Christians who cop out are only adding to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of Christians, they have, I refer to it as a pietistic. There's a healthy biblical pietism where we should pursue holiness and be holy people, of course, be faithful to the scriptures and live holy lives. But there's kind of a pietistic notion that's a bit Gnostic almost, where if we involve ourselves with the things of the world, if we get involved in these either conversations or if we try to change kind of the world that we're in and resist tyranny and that kind of thing, they feel they're getting their hands dirty, or they feel that it's too worldly to get involved in these matters. And so I don't know what to make sense of that. You know, it feels like a reluctance for a lot of people. They're like, well, you know, that seems, I've even heard this as a pastor to people in my church. They're saying, why are you so concerned with culture? Why are you so concerned with engaging and speaking on these matters? Why can't we just focus on what the Bible says and be, you know, faithful to that? And that's good enough for us. We don't need to involve ourselves with Boulder and talking about the ways our city is either overreaching or the way our city is propagating, you know, in our city hall, they've got the trans flag, you know, and so we don't need to talk about that. And to me as a pastor who moved here I want to see Boulder love God. You know, that's what I want to see. I want to see the people of Boulder love God. And that to me is a supreme example of rebellion against God. And to me, it feels like we've got to talk about it. So how would you help me? How would you talk about that matter, that tension where a lot of Christians just don't want to deal with that kind of stuff?
Well, I would start where they say they start, by keeping it biblical. Pietism is wonderful as it started, say, in Halle in Germany. It was a warm-hearted devotion to the Lord and to Jesus. Wonderful. Warm-hearted, worshipful devotion. In other words, faith is not an assent. It's not a list of doctrines. At its heart, it's a relationship rooted in a warm-hearted worship and devotion to Jesus. That was pietism. Wonderful. But the trouble is you had pietism added to what the social scientists call privatization. It was kept private. Now, of course, in the Bible, the lordship of Christ was everywhere the Christian life went. What is culture? Culture is just a way of life lived in common. So we not only worship on Sunday, we run our families Christianly in the Lord's way. We treat our neighbors Christianly. We treat our colleagues, and we work Christianly. In other words, we bring the lordship of Christ because he called us to be salty and light-bearing. These are symbols of engagement, penetration, expansion. We bring them to everywhere. And when Christians live that way, it produces a Christian culture of light and salt. It's healthy. And if we keep it all privately, in other words, put the light under a bushel, as our Lord says, or the salt loses its saltiness, worth nothing except to be thrown out. And there's a huge amount of the Christian faith in this country, which is not only pietistic, that's wonderful, that worshipful devotion, but it's privatized. You know, Theodore Roszak in the 60s, he was the man who said first, he was talking about California. Much of the faith down there is, quote, privately engaging, publicly irrelevant. Now that is a betrayal of Jesus, whether it's Berkeley or whether it's Boulder or whether it's Madison. Christ is the Lord of everything or is the Lord of nothing.
Right.
So some of these people are too pious by half. What they're really saying is they've copped out. They have a privatized faith, which is a fundamental denial of the lordship of Jesus over the whole of life. Now, of course, Chase, we've got to work out, you mentioned the pride flag. You've got to work out how we take on the world that's so different.
Yeah.
And so on. That's another question. But that we should live every part of our lives Christianly, that's how America in the past was as profoundly shaped by the gospel as it was. It's evangelical cop-out. I mean, the liberal church has compromised the faith, and that's a tragedy of a different kind. But the evangelical church in America has become so privatized that it's become privately engaging, publicly irrelevant, no longer salty.
That's a hard word to hear, but I have to admit it seems true to me from what, I grew up in the church and I've seen a lot. One of the fears, I guess, and I've seen a lot of writing on this from ministers and Christians, is that as this kind of illiberalism rises, particularly on the left, where it's very, you must use the right pronouns, you must believe the right narrative and all these kind of things. And there's yard signs everywhere that have the creedal kind of affirmations of the new kind of leftist ideas. And so a lot of Christians, though, are still reluctant. They're scared because I'll use an example. In our county, you'll get these drag queen story hours, right, for kids. And so for a lot of Christians, their conviction is, well, it's a free country. And so if people want to do that, why should we stop them? And my attitude is different, where I'm like, that's immoral. And what, freedom has its limits in terms of like what we can permit in society. So how do you navigate that kind of stuff? Because we want to honor the biblical principles of freedom, but what do you do with something like that? How do you help Christians think Christianly about a topic like that, where they obviously have an impetus where it's like, we want to win hearts, we want to be a free society, but is that really what we want in our society? How would you help answer that?
Well, the central part of my book is about that freedom. Everyone says freedom, but certain freedoms are specious and false.
Okay.
And one of the points I make there, a very obvious point, anyone knows the history of freedom, the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. So again, you take the Exodus. Look at Moses and Pharaoh at the beginning. Who is the freest man in Egypt? The Pharaoh. By the end, even his own courtiers are persuading him to let the people go. But he won't. And he becomes a victim. He's obsessed. And obsession is really a kind of slavery to an idea. Addiction is slavery to a behavior. Why is America the land of the free? Got more recovery groups and addicts than any nation in history. Because American freedom's gone all wrong. And we've got to point out, now you've got to be specific here, talking about grooming through drag queens and so on, and then sex. But go back, we're talking about the sexual revolution.
Yeah.
I say the red wave is classical and cultural Marxism, and the cultural one is the more important. You've also got the so-called rainbow wave, the sexual revolution. Now, a lot of people think that went back to Hefner, 1960s, the pill, Playboy, permissiveness, and so on. Nonsense. The sexual revolution goes back to the Palais Royal in Paris, the same quarter where the political revolution came from. So take some of the architects. The man who gave us the term sexual revolution was Wilhelm Reich in the 1920s and 30s. He says quite openly, we're out to undermine 3,000 years of civilization, the Jewish and the Christian. And he's quite open. You read his little book, it's a paperback, quite easy to read. He says we've got two enemies, the family and the church. So you take the family. He's writing in 1920s. You can see stuff earlier, around 1900 with H.G. Wells. You want sex education at 3 and 4. Why? to sideline parents because they're against the patriarchal family. And, of course, they're against the church. So make no mistake, your people who won't take these things on, they're rather like people in Germany. You remember Martin Niemöller, who didn't make a stand as a pastor and then was arrested. And he said in his famous saying after the war, they first came for the trade unionists. And I wasn't a trade unionist, so I didn't stand. And then they came for the Jews, but I wasn't a Jew, so I didn't stand. And then they came for the Catholics, and I was a Protestant, so I didn't make a stand. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to stand. That is happening in its own ways today, and people who talk these specious views of freedom and so on are naive and foolish and dangerous.
So the Christian view of freedom, to go back to your book, is one that's rooted in God's truth, that is derived from the Hebrew Bible, from Exodus, and one which is, would you say it's a bounded freedom? How would you differentiate the two views? One is a personal kind of revolutionary freedom. Obviously, we've talked about the French and American Revolution.
Remember, they're both revolutionary. You have to say in what way. But
yeah, so tell me more.
Take some of the simplest definitions. Lord Acton, the great historian of freedom, a Catholic layman, he said simply, freedom is not the permission to do what you like. It's the power to do what you ought. Now, unpack that. You said that yourself earlier. You could put it this way. Socrates said the unexamined life isn't worth living. The Bible would say the uninstructed life is not worth living. Freedom requires truth. Freedom requires character. Freedom requires a way of life. So you've got a 3-year-old, you can put him in front of a keyboard and they can plunk down much noise and batter away with their fingers on the keys. Is that music? No. To become a concert pianist, you've got to go through the so-called 10,000 hours principle. Practice, discipline, mastery of your field of music, and then you can play beautifully, and you're free. And so, well, that's freedom too. So there's one thing. Or take another one. This is a very important one today. Isaiah Berlin, whom I mentioned, the Jewish philosopher, he says you've got to have negative freedom and positive freedom. You need both.
Okay.
So negative freedom is freedom from, positive freedom is freedom for, to be. Well, the second one obviously requires truth. Who am I supposed to be? Am I a machine? Am I an animal, chimpanzee, or am I made in the image and likeness of God? Positive freedom will be different according to the truth that you're convinced is true. But negative freedom, here's the point the Bible is so distinctive. To be free, yes, we were created free. Yes, we're called to free, as Paul says. But to be free, we have to be set free. And that's one of the distinctives of the Bible. To be free, you have to be set free. In other words, freedom from means you can't be under an addiction or under a bully or under a totalitarian dictator. But the Christian would say, no, nor can you be under sin. And we need to be freed from those forces of darkness, sin and death and the evil one. And you've got to take seriously inner freedom before you start talking about outer political freedom. In other words, there are a lot of things in the Scriptures which are magnificent if we think about them. They give us the deepest, richest, highest view of freedom, and we should be the champions of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great privilege to be a pastor today during these times because of what you just talked about. It's humbling and it's exciting. And unfortunately, a lot of pastors are tired and exhausted, and so they're overwhelmed. But I think it's important to remember what a great privilege it is. One final question I think I'd like to kind of punt your way is I'm curious to know, we've talked about revolution, and obviously there's a positive view of revolution and a negative. And we've contrasted that. You've explained that between the French and the American. And, given the cultural climate we live in today, particularly in America, there's a lot of questions that a lot of just normal people have regarding, either the tyrannical overreach of the government regarding a different variety of issues, or kind of the globalism that are particularly left side of the aisle seems to be in cahoots with the WEF and other such global organizations. And so a lot of people are curious, okay, obviously back in the American Revolution, it seems like they went in and had that kind of ethos in the water to form a new republic, to separate. And a lot of pastors actually spoke on that. There's a great book, I can't remember his name, but it's called Justifying Revolution. He's a professor at CCU. And he just kind of explained the pastoral writings during that era and how the Bible was there. And so how do you help Christians think about today, given the cultural climate, what does it look like to be a light in the darkness, and pull on our heritage, and knowing that our forefathers seem to have gone to war over less. And so maybe that's why you're talking about we need a new Lincoln, or we need a new leader. But how do you help Christians think about these things?
Well, if you know my book on calling, which is by far my bestseller compared with the others, I believe we start in terms of our personal faith and then our calling and the spheres in which the Lord has put each of us. So It's quite different from a homemaker to a computer scientist or a lawyer, a politician or an astronaut or a factory worker or a farmer. So I always start with people's personal faith to make sure that's as rich and deep as it should be, then applying it in the sphere of their calling. So we're all small. You take René Dubos's famous saying, think globally, act locally. In other words, our minds can go all over the world, but our little bodies are stuck where we are. And there's a tension between the global and the local, between the world and the parish, as John Wesley put it. And we've got to get people to see this is my gift. Your gift, Chase, different from my gift, and both of ours different from my wife's and everybody else we know. So we've got to be content to be who we are. Sufficient unto the day is I'm just a little person. There's very little I can do, but I've got to do everything I can do and no less. And to get people to see that. Now, I'd go on in all sorts of ways. And one of the big things that the American church is missing is a biblical sense of time. You have the wonderful words of the signs of the times. David's men, who were skilled in reading it, our Lord rebuking his generation because they couldn't read the signs of the times. They were good meteorologists. They knew the weather, but they didn't know the signs of the times. That's often missing in the church. Or you have that wonderful saying of St. Paul describing David. He served God's purpose in his generation and fell asleep, Acts 13. That's wonderful, but you've got to understand your generation. Where are we? We're an incredible moment for the American Republic, but wider. We're in a civilizational moment. Western civilization is in crisis. And we've got to respond to all these things. And so that biblical view of time is so important. So I'd start with people's faith and their calling and their gifts and their spheres of life, but then try and expand the horizon. So we have Christians who are really responsible and prophetic, small or great. They're just speaking into the times and acting into the times, because this is a most extraordinary time.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a delight and so helpful. I mean, just for me personally as a pastor, I feel greatly encouraged. A lot of clarity has been brought. So thanks for spending time with me, Oz.
No, great privilege. Thanks for having me.
Is there a website that people should go to find more of your writings, like ozguinness.com?
Yeah, ozguinness.com. You said it.
That's great. And then obviously,
Guinness.
That's great. That's great. Then you mentioned that your book on calling. Is there a book that you, obviously you've got your book coming out, 0 Hour America. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. If somebody's never read anything by you, is there a book that you would recommend saying, hey, this is going to be a great introduction to kind of the way I approach things?
Well, half of my books are on faith. So The Call, the bestseller I mentioned, has nothing to do with politics immediately. For those who are more interested in contemporary affairs, I had a little book called A Free People's Suicide, which puts some of the challenges of sustaining freedom in rather simple ways. And, an idea picked up widely is the notion of the golden triangle of freedom coming in that book. So that's one people could read, along with the present one, which is short, as I said, impassioned.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Oz. If you're a listener and you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to give it a great rating, give it a like on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, share this content with others. I always want these conversations to be conversation starters. And so if you've got a friend who you've been meaning to talk to, you've noticed they've gone adrift, share this episode with them and go buy them a cup of coffee and let that inspire more robust dialogue on matters relating to godliness, holiness, and living faithfully during these cultural times. And we will have our next guest, Robert Brewis. That episode is coming out next week, so you can look forward to that. And until then, we'll see you.